So, human infrastructure resources, again, these are the built environment resources, the water purification plants, the sewage treatment plants at all major national parks. A place like Yosemite Valley has as many people in it at one time during peak season as about one full Carbondale. And Carbondale has waterworks, right, for cleaning water coming in and cleaning water going out. And the standard for that water quality has to be very, very, very high, right? If their only option in Yosemite Valley, a glacially sculpted, steep-walled, 1,000-foot wall valley with really one way out, the Merced River, if they are discharging a whole bunch of treated, but still chemically super heavily loaded, saturated, essentially wastewater discharge, well, that's going to kill everything downstream. So I have to process that very, very carefully. So we're not usually thinking along the lines of running a water treatment plant at a place like Yosemite or Yellowstone. And all this stuff is deliberately kind of tucked away behind all of that parkitecture, right? Pretty important thing. But this is something that gets us to just day-to-day sustainability, right? With a lot of people pooping, we've got to do something with all of that nitrate, all of those birth control hormones excreted in urine that are in measurable levels, just like washing down the Mississippi River all day, every day, right? We're drinking the birth control hormones of people upstream, if you want to think of it that way. Folks in Minnesota, for example, pee, flush the toilet, and all of the metabolites of the medications that they use is in that water. And if the water treatment, if the water purification on the inbound side doesn't have specific measures to get rid of those chemicals, they're still there, right? Primary treatment for drinking water is to sterilize it, but that doesn't do anything with the chemical content of it. It just kills anything that's trying to live in that water between the plant and your faucet or your shower, okay? So this is the level at which we're thinking about stuff. We're basically running a city for each of these major parks. And where each of these parks has specific, very specific and unique constraints on the availability of things like water, for example, this is going to put some unique demands on infrastructure. So for example, at Grand Canyon National Park, there is that one pipe that brings water up from the Colorado 5,000 vertical feet. It is like custom welded in place and goes up each tier or terrace of the Grand Canyon and then up the vertical cliff faces into Grand Canyon Village for sterilization, treatment, processing, and then distribution to people and activities like firefighting. And then the waste is treated very, very, very carefully and then discharged. And so part of running Grand Canyon National Park is constantly, like 100 times a year, literally. Think about this. Twice a week, they're sending out repair crews to weld patches and put pipe patch sleeves on that one pipe because the vertical change is a mile and water pressure increases exponentially with vertical height, which is why dams are not vertical walls. They're hyperbolic arches that have to be extremely thick down at the bottom to deal with all that water pressure, trying to push that water sideways through the dam or through the metal pipe. And so that pipe is constantly just trying to die, right? This is a unique thing for foresters to think about this stuff. So, on the upside, we don't have to be water sanitation engineers. We don't have to be that kind of a chemical engineer. A place like Yosemite National Park has a couple of thousand people working there, and part of that staff are dedicated specialists for all of these things, right? So you can make pretty good money fixing cars, working in the motor pool for the Park Service at any of these remote places, because there's just not a lot of mechanics around, so the ones that they have to be real good, because if somebody breaks down with their RV there, you know, there's not a lot of companies around to bail them out typically. So we have a very particular set of skills. We don't know what the tourists have done with our daughter, but when we find them, No. This is kind of the logistical thing that we are dealing with as park rangers. So, it is said in military circles that amateurs talk tactics, experts talk logistics. Let's talk a little bit about the logistics of running a infrastructure resources. So, let's talk about kind of loose groupings by class or type. We have a whole bunch of facilities that, since basically my childhood, thanks to the Americans with Disabilities Act, they have to be accessible. So think about this. We just got done talking on Monday, this last class session, about how trails, for example, are not the opportunity. They're not the reason that people are coming. The trail helps connect you to the experience on site that is the opportunity. Right? So we talked about opportunity resources, experiential resources, and the infrastructure resources that connect people to them. Trails are like that. And all new construction has to be accessible. Period. So when you're doing trail maintenance, this raises the very important question for the basic existential safety of your visitors. If I have a trail that's rugged, do I need to smooth it out such that somebody in a wheelchair could do it? This leads to a problem that we've mentioned before, called product shift. We talked on Monday about how the experience, the opportunity, the motivation, the goal of hiking from the South Rim Village of the Grand Canyon down a vertical mile, forward several miles, 8, 10, 15 miles, depending on the route that you take, down to the Colorado River and Phantom Ranch on the far side, for example. That's a pretty cool thing. And product shift stands as a threat to the experience of hiking down and then hiking back out, a so-called rim-to-rim hike. So this product shift is, if 100 years from now, the hike down the canyon and hike back up out of the canyon is fundamentally different somehow. It's shifted. The product on offer, the experience on offer has shifted to the point that it's somehow fundamentally different than the hike that folks experienced 100 years ago when Grand Canyon was first kind of getting stood up on its own four legs as a national park. So we can see some tension here. ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and subsequent similar legislation has said that whenever you put in a visitor center or a campsite or a bathroom, it's got to be, at least some portion of that has got to be set aside for and 100% smooth and safe for somebody in a wheelchair, or somebody using crutches, or someone using a walker, or someone using a cane. For example, as mobility disabilities are clearly and explicitly protected, they have to be able to do this. And so we shouldn't have examples in our national parks that serve as an antitype example or a counter example. We shouldn't have steps with wheelchair stickers on each step. Like, this is legit illegal in the United States. And most first world countries, most developed countries, we would say, have similar legislation. So we're not particularly special in this, right? So that ramp is necessary, or that elevator is necessary. All of the things that we get used to, those texture strips, those rumble strips at sidewalks, at crossroads, at crosswalks and stuff like that. So a blind person walking or a vision impaired person walking with a cane can perceive tactilely instead of visually that they're coming to a place in the sidewalk where the sidewalk slopes down, and that slope down is into vehicular traffic. You have to have a special chunk of textured pavement, usually those little bumps, Campus installed them here when we redid a bunch of the sidewalks, I don't know, 5 years ago, something like that. And just concrete sawed out big squares and dropped in those textured sections, and that's good. Anybody who's visually impaired can find those. Seeing eye dogs, service animals, can be trained to find those and alert their person that, hey, you're coming up to a stop in the sidewalk. This is a less safe environment. Pay more attention, navigate across, and so forth. Okay, so when we add ramps, when we smooth out trails, that can lead to this product shift. So for somebody who is mobility limited, mobility impaired, a little bit less steady on their legs, or not in full control of their legs, or don't have legs, we've got to have something for them too, because they're regular folks just like anybody else. We just see that they need to move a little bit differently through their environment, but they have every bit as much right and derive every bit as much benefit as everybody else does from the experience of hiking down into the Grand Canyon or getting down to the bottom of the canyon somehow. So this tension in needing to honor, and this is the right thing to do, right? I'm not complaining about this. You know, getting a place fully functional and compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act is a good and right and moral thing. It's not just a legal requirement. It's a good thing. But it can, if people just pave everything over, smooth everything out, lead to a phenomenon called, in our circles, mountains with handrails. And in the last 20 or 30 years, this mountains with handrails thing has been identified as the more specific way that successive innovations, successive inventions like planning out a trail so that it is very accessible, very safe for somebody in a wheelchair, how that becomes product shift inadvertently. So there's a famous book titled Mountains Without Handrails. And it was basically saying, hey guys and gals and non-binary pals, we are getting into a place of we're filing off all the rough edges on a lot of these famous trails. We're making things, and tell me what you think about this. In some places, we're making things too easy. The experience is going soft. And the author of Mountains Without Handrails and part of the community was like, yeah, okay, yeah, we are fundamentally changing what it's like to move from one end of Mammoth Cave to the other. It's a cave. It's a wild environment. It's really rugged. So putting in 20-foot wide smooth concrete paths with literal handrails in a whole bunch of places in Mammoth Cave, are we taking something away by adding something? Are we making it impossible for everybody to connect with that wild cave sense in order to make things a little bit easier and more accessible for folks who legitimately and legally and morally deserve some valid options on experiencing the same stuff as the rest of us? So let's pause in the lecture here for a sec and wrestle with this. What do you think, or maybe how have you seen in the past, the experience at your beloved state park right outside your neighborhood or a place that you used to go a lot? They put in some new facilities and it just ain't what it once was. Anybody? Have you ever gone to a place long enough that you've seen some meaningful changes in the core experience of it? It's not what it once was. For some of you young whippersnappers, this might be a harder question to come up with lots of good examples, but for us gray hairs, Gary, what do you think?
Yeah.
Okay. So the phrase mountains with handrails was taken from a place called Half Dome at Yosemite National Park. Half Dome is a pretty cool spot. It's a granite dome. So basically a wave of magma, or like a hot spot of magma, kind of a bubble of it, that cooled very slowly over the course of several million years into granite. And then the softer overburden was eroded away, and then, so exposing it to the surface. And then a glacier came and snapped off half of Half Dome. If you think of Half Dome shaped kind of like a Hershey's Kiss or a chocolate chip, imagine chopping that in half, and then a glacier pushing half of that mountain down and away. Is exactly what happened there. Okay? So we've got the sheer couple of 1,000-foot cliff face, and then this beautiful steep-walled but beautifully rounded and smooth granite thing going on. And there's an approach trail. It's a very famous hike. The trail starts where the approach up to Half Dome starts 7 or 10 miles into the wilderness in the high country around Yosemite Valley. And if you want to get there and enjoy Half Dome Summit during the day, you got to start hiking at like 3, 4 in the morning. It's a pretty cool experience. As it turns out, smooth granite is slippery when wet. And so, this being Yosemite and getting the weather that it does and having people stuck on top of a smooth but very steep, not quite vertical, but getting there, geologic feature during things like, regular daily summer electrical storms, lightning storms. That's a problem. Everybody sees that storm cloud off in the distance getting bigger and getting darker real fast, and so everybody tries to get down the one access path at once. And it starts raining, and that smooth granite, polished by snow, polished by just the natural formation of granite crystals, it gets real slick, and so people are sort of picking their way down this real steep slope. It's about like that, so well over 100% slope. And for people who lose their footing, they start sliding in an uncontrolled way, and then they start rolling, and then they start bouncing right next to the column of people trying to pick their way down. And by the time you hit the bottom, your body has basically high-speed disassembled itself, euphemistically speaking. So this is a real deal. It's a real problem. And so, in response, the Park Service did a very sensible thing. If this is what Half Dome is like, and you have a whole bunch of people down here who want to be up here, they put a whole bunch of steel posts, drilled them permanently into the rock, permanently modifying, some would say impacting, this granite resource. And they strung steel cables in between these posts. And you can you don't have to have a climbing harness, you just sort of hand over hand pull your way up. And it's a pretty burly experience. And even with that, some people would try to go away from those and get around the people maybe who are moving a little bit more slowly than somebody would like. They would go outside of that, and then they would slip and fall down and die. So this was a thing, a literal mountain with handrails that fundamentally changed the experience of hiking to the top of Half Dome, and it kind of didn't work. People were still dying because it focused all of the traffic onto those cables. And when people get crowded in like a lightning storm and sort of a panic-inducing kind of a situation, people start making some hasty decisions, a few of which will lead to death or destruction, right? So, what do you think? The Park Service, they're committed. They drilled permanent anchors for those steel posts for Half Dome. Is this okay? Does that civilize the experience too much to have steel cable handrails up this mountain? What do you think? This is not a clear-cut, simple answer, so this is a genuine question. Yeah.
I think it's like totally valid with certain iconic places, like maybe Half Dome or like Grand Canyon or places at Yellowstone, I'm not sure, but to have those areas be more accessible to people who couldn't maybe do those hikes on their own as they were before.
So if there's no substitute for Half Dome, which is a useful strategy, it helps increase our supply of whatever resource that folks are trying to connect with. If we don't have anything, we could say, hey, if you can't make it up Half Dome, try the other one like 2 miles up the valley. Similar view, a lot less steep approach, but it's kind of a different thing. Then you figure out how to get people up the unique, irreplaceable approach. Okay? I can buy that for $1. Good call. Yeah, Sarah.
Do you have to have a permit to go up Half Dome?
You do?
You do? I was gonna say, because I didn't know. Because, like, I've heard of stuff that, like, there's people that go up Half Dome that probably don't have experience that are, like, going up there getting permits and, like, causing issues and stuff with, like, that kind of stuff. So I didn't know if you had to have one or not.
Wait. Okay, so you're saying the Park Service can play favorites, and if you're low skill, they could shut you out of this hike? This non-technical rock climb, as we would call it? This is one step shy on the Yosemite climbing system, for those of you, or rating system, for those of you who are climbers. This is one step below bouldering. It's non-technical, off-harness rock climbing. So, like, level 1 would be like sidewalk and trail, and then harder stuff, and then steep, like hands down scramble, and then harness on, but you don't totally need it, versus harness on and you definitely need it. Would be Yosemite 5X rated stuff. So, can the Park Service do that though? Like, isn't that kind of a dick move to shut a bunch of people out if they're not like expert hikers? This is a real question. A lot of people's trip quality hangs in the balance. Yosemite's in the million+ category for visitation every year, so this is a big question for a lot of people. Should the Park Service be able to turn people away that they don't think are qualified in their judgment?
I think it's fair because you don't want some moron climbing up the side of a mountain that has no business doing it. I mean, even like big trails and stuff like that, you have to have a permit for it just so they make sure that no one's dying.
That's exactly it. So, in a situation where the justification or rationale is kind of along these lines, in a situation where you have folks who could potentially hurt themselves, but crucially, who could also potentially hurt other people, that's when the Park Service generally takes a much closer look at intervening a lot more directly and limiting use for some people, right? That's that fourth strategy, limiting use. Shutting some people out, that is really kind of a radioactive option in most cases. But where people are dying, maybe you're doing them a favor. You're helping people not get themselves unalived. Okay, so in places like that, where there's a specific and clear and sort of localized safety concern, yeah, we can go real hard on management interventions. The management maxim or aphorism that we're going to use for this situation is intensive use must be managed intensively, full stop. So, a bunch of my master's research was around this idea of these intensively used places. Is it okay for the Park Service to kind of put up some fences, keep people out of some places? And by and large, as long as people understand why, like if you give them a little sign at the beginning of the fenced-in section of a trail, like, hey, we're letting this area recover, so, nothing against you, you're not doing anything wrong, we're just going to help everybody do the right thing by fencing off this section of the trail to keep off-trail travel limited. People are largely cool with it. and close to 99% of people will stay on the correct side of the fence. This answer, this decision of limiting use gets a little bit trickier when we shift context from the Half Dome approach cables to a more open, permissive environment like at the Grand Canyon. So anybody who was on summer camp this past year when we were at the Grand Canyon, think back to all of the signs you saw that tried to help people understand how dangerous it is to do a rim to rim, or even worse, a rim to rim to rim hike in one day. There are like 6 foot by 8 foot signs with pictures of people who have died on the trail that visitors are about to go on. And some of these real big signs are real close to the trailhead, Bright Angel Trailhead, for example, where you would start this hike. They want to make it absolutely painfully clear to everybody, English speaker and reader or not, that hey, you're entering a lethal environment when you drop into the Grand Canyon. And people die here every year. And some of them thought they were just as invincible as you probably do, dear reader at the trailhead. So they have pictures and profiles and like descriptions of the deaths of people like active duty military who are here on vacation, in peak physical condition, never be in better condition in their lives, and they got overheated and died. There's one who was an ultra marathoner who got separated from a group, ran out of water, and died. And it's this long list of people. There are entire books collecting just everybody who's died at the Grand Canyon and how since the 1800s. And it's every bit as dangerous as those cables at Half Dome. Now, statistically speaking, it's a little bit less dangerous to hike at the Grand Canyon because a lot more people hike at the Grand Canyon and a few more people die versus a lot fewer people even attempting the cables at Half Dome, even though it's still very popular, and a few people dying. Does that make sense? So relatively speaking, between those two, on an annualized basis or a per 100,000 visitors basis, the cables at Half Dome are a bit safer, but people are dying in both cases. And we as humans, we tend to focus on are people dying or not versus 2.1 per 100,000 visitors or 1.8 per 100,000 visitors. This is a slightly safer hike at 1.8 people per 100,000 visitors dying annually. It's kind of cold and analytical and harsh to reduce living human fellow Americans and international visitors to statistics like this, but when you're dealing with millions of visitors and visits, we've got to take a look, at least partially, on a statistical basis, okay? So, the Park Service's position for the Grand Canyon is not to limit people. If you just want a day hike down into the canyon a little bit, they're not going to make you get a permit for it. You don't have to go to the backcountry office and sign on the dotted line and pay $80 like you do if you want to go backpacking down in the canyon. So this past summer and every summer we go to the Grand Canyon, we get up at 4 in the morning and sit in line and get our number to come back the next day to get in line and get backpacking permits down into the canyon. And if you just want a day hike, that's fine. You totally can. If you want a day hike down to the Colorado and do 2 miles of vertical change and about a 20-ish mile hike round trip in a day, you can absolutely do that. But the Park Service is going to absolutely clobber you with messages trying to help you understand, trying to help sensitize you or activate you to make a better informed choice than biting that off. And it's hard. It doesn't really work. Quite frankly, people glance at signs. In our research at other places, people spend between 1 to 3 seconds reading a sign, like the whole sign, which might have a couple of 100 words of text, a whole bunch of images, and so on and so forth. So you get like one long sentence, if you want to think of it that way, one long sentence to get your message across. And in order to do that, the Park Service has played around a lot with stuff like skull and crossbones and warning in all capital letters, big block font, you know? Like it looks like a traffic hazard kind of a sign, like wreck ahead, watch out, kind of a thing. Because people are only even mostly going to read about a sentence worth of content out of that whole sign. And so it's probably going to be the title of the sign. And if that title isn't immediately getting to the point, then we've lost that opportunity and that person is in real danger. I've seen, personally, 2 bodies pulled out of the Grand Canyon. This is a dangerous place. But the Park Service, in recognizance of the idea that there is no foolproof way to make the Grand Canyon hike a fundamentally safe experience, we're not going to try and pave the trails all the way down. We're not going to try to put a cable car system all the way down like you see at Gatlinburg or something like that. We're not going to dynamite a road into the cliff face and drive people up and down. We're going to let people know and make an informed choice. And some people are going to die as a result of that. So what do you think about that? Is that a valid conclusion? That's what the Park Service has done, to the satisfaction of many, millions, and to the deep and irreparable grief of some families who lost a loved one, or multiple loved ones. In 2019 when we were there, a little boy was swept into the Colorado River after hiking down with his family, and the Colorado River is like Whitewater Rapids type river in the Grand Canyon, and his grandmother saw him getting swept away. She jumped in to get him, and they both were killed. So this affects real families, folks who were not planning on dying that day, pretty much every time. And it affects the Park Service, wilderness EMTs, and wilderness first responders who are jogging 80-pound packs down every time somebody is reported in acute stress. Imagine being that ranger, jogging on a stone trail miles at a time with an 80-pound pack to help somebody who ran out of water because they didn't pay attention to the multiple signs they definitely saw along the way. That's hard on your body. You can't keep doing that forever. So this has a real human cost to you and me, the park rangers working at a place like this, okay? And then all of these issues in microcosm at other parks. Long's Peak is a dangerous hike at Rocky. The Precipice Trail at Acadia very occasionally has an injury or a fatality on it. When things like rock falls happen, like there's no body recovery effort, you're just looking for any trace DNA to confirm to the families that their people were lost and buried under, 50,000 tons of rock. That's a thing. So what do you think? Is the Park Service's approach here okay? Keep going, business as usual? Ship it, and occasionally scrape some bodies off the ground? All right. Some folks disagree with that approach. And so this provokes some lively debate, shall we say, at different times. But it's not all about these extreme moments, right? So the vast majority of people are not even attempting a rim-to-rim hike at the Grand Canyon. Most folks won't get more than a couple of 100 yards down the trail, and then it's kind of that moment of, whew, let me catch my breath. Yeah, I'm good. All right, back up and out, 200-yard hike, round trip. So that's what this can look like in places like the Grand Canyon. This is part of the Rim Trail, and there are miles and miles of this asphalt, this tar and chip type path. If you look closely when the video repeats, We've got these coping stones lining both sides of the trail. It's not a fence, but it's a very clear visual demarcation that is difficult to walk on or over without rolling your ankle. They make those low stone walls on either side of the trail, those scree walls as they're called, deliberately a little bit uncomfortable or risky to walk on. Okay, that's called site ruination, to deny people an attractive way to get off of the trail. Okay. So most of the visitor days are spent on this, and this is great. That tar and chip, that hardened surface, is graded to be a very, very slow, gentle, rolling climb or descent. It's pretty durable relative to the foot traffic, so we can handle millions of footprints on each particular spot here without really thinking much about it at all. It's fairly easy to repair, and we've got road construction equipment here at the park. We can resurface this every X number of years as a program of scheduled maintenance. Not a big deal. The trail's down into the canyon, totally different story. Okay? So, we also have stuff like at the general store at the Grand Canyon. Gary, what'd you think of the general store and the post office and the 2 restaurants and the ice cream stand and the lodge off of this parking lot here at the Grand Canyon?
You just think you're in the middle of the town when you walk in.
Yeah, pretty remote, rugged, primitive, rustic, except where you can get slushies, or pay a lot of extra money for like hiking poles that you forgot at home. Dang it.
When you walk in, it's just like a grocery store.
Yeah, they've got, I don't even know how many kinds of beer there, right? So this is what most people are arriving to experience. It's camping. It's not testing our mettle and, fighting back against Mother Nature. It's a pretty 10-ply, as they say in Letterkenny, trip. Okay? So, this is to kind of reemphasize, hey, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about stuff like garbage cans and recycle bins and bear-resistant stuff, so that regular folks coming in without any training at all can be as safe as we can make them, safe and comfortable. They're having a good trip that way. Okay? So, it's got to work for the person in a stability setup or visually impaired or what have you, because that's where the center of mass is among your visitors. So the person who is going down into the canyon like some of our students do for summer camp for 3, 4, 5 nights at a time to backpack around to different campsites in the canyon and really have like a deep in the canyon wilderness, backcountry, rugged and genuinely challenging experience, that is like a fraction of the percent of people here. Okay? So, in management, we got to make some hard decisions. We have a trails budget, and we have a carrying capacity for some number of miles of trail that the canyon's ecosystem can handle before the fact of having more trails, more people on those trails, more campsites that serve those trails, more trail crews out there maintaining those trails. At some point, there are too many miles of trails relative to the species that are obligated to live in that environment. And so we start harming the ecosystem by having too much, by overkill on infrastructure. So there's a real and meaningful management trade-off on, well, if we don't have any miles of trail, then we don't have to maintain any miles of trail, and the problem kind of limits itself. Versus at the other opposite, also absurd extreme, if the whole place is crisscrossed with trails, our visitors can get everywhere and do anything and select any level of difficulty that they want because they're all possible to select. Typically, management is compromises and trade-offs, right? So we're going to have some actual solutions somewhere in between. Instead of 50,000 miles, hypothetically, of trails just crisscrossing the entire land surface of the Grand Canyon, both on the rims and at the canyon environment itself, we have something much less than that in actuality. And so our work as rangers on the infrastructure resource side is to figure out, okay, how many miles of trail are we doing? And as it turns out, we can do some pretty clear and straightforward analyses and computations and simulation modeling and stuff like that to figure out how many miles of trail is enough without being too much relative to the actual number of users we have, their distribution in time, their distribution in space, how many are at the North Rim versus the South Rim, for example, and things like what percentage of our, let's say, rounded off at 7 million visitors a year, how many of those really genuinely do want to get down in the canyon and will try it if we give them access, okay? Versus how many folks would try to get down in the canyon if we didn't give them access and they had to kind of make it up as they went, and we might have a lot more safety concerns in that case, okay? So these accessible facilities are going to be sort of a tag, a distinguisher for any of the facilities we're talking about coming up, like trails, campsites, bathhouses. There's a big laundry and shower house at Grand Canyon's Mather Campground that serves, there's probably, 30 washing machines in there, and maybe a dozen or more men's showers and a dozen or more women's showers, that sort of a thing. We got to figure out how much is enough without being too much. So these accessible facilities, they are really expensive. A paved multi-use path, like what we saw there, which is lit and in a developed environment, can cost $1 million a mile. So when we get down into the nuts and bolts of management, we're talking about stuff like, okay, if I got $100,000 budget this year to either cut new trails, maintain current trails, close down any problematic sections of trail and relocate around those problematic areas and so forth, how am I going to allocate that out? There's a cost per linear foot of trail, there's a cost per square foot of parking area, there's a cost per square foot of visitor center, general store, and lodge, and admin facility like the motor pool, and so forth. And so accessible facilities are typically going to be at the high end of this. But the legislation requires that whenever you renovate a facility, part of the renovation, if it's not already accessible for at least one of the bathroom stalls in each bathroom and so forth, and a proportional number of handicap accessible parking spots in the parking lot, like one for every 50 spaces or something like that, then you need to add those things as a part of the renovation, and you can't do the renovation legally unless you are bringing it up to code, as it's called. Okay? So, accessible facilities, they are expensive, right? There's specialized stuff. It takes more space per unit of it, and that's okay, right? They're serving an important and real good function. We just can't do ADA accessible trails, so that's going to be with just a couple of % grade. Okay? More than about 5% grade, and some people don't have the grip strength to stop a wheelchair's uncontrolled acceleration is the primary issue there. We can make trails very smooth, and then we can play a game of catch up after every rainstorm after that to make the erosion that happened on that smooth section of trail made it rugose, or not smooth anymore. Rugose is a fancy word for rough. Okay? So, the surface of the earth, the shape of the surface of the earth, the character of the soil, what fragment, or what proportion or fraction of the soil is in coarse fragments. Those are hard to make smooth and ADA compliant. Are you gonna have to rock bar a bunch of boulders out of your trail surface, or are you gonna have to bring in a bunch of mixed fines fill to amend that, or kind of low-key pave over that with an improved surface? Some places are just gonna be real hard, real expensive, and never gonna be flat. So in some cases, you don't have to try. It's just going to be a rugged trail. Now, if you have miles of rugged trail for your visitors, as is the case at pretty much every national park, then you also got to have at least a couple of miles of trails that are totally accessible. So, have you guys ever seen like pretty burly hiking trails at any park you've been to, and then there's like what may have felt to some of you like a super soft hike like around the visitor center? In some places, literally a loop trail around the building? That's a thing. And that is partially to make sure that for, get this, the majority of people who are never more than 500 meters from their vehicle ever during trips to national parks. That's a majority of your visitors. That blows my mind. Never more than 1,500 feet or so-ish from their vehicles. For those folks, they have a trail too. And yeah, it might not get them real far from the visitor center, but a lot of them don't really mind. Like, that's okay. They'll get to see a bunch of the native plants and vegetation and interpretive signs that are easy and less expensive to post around the visitor center than they are to hike out or pack train out with pack animals out to some remote spot where relatively few people will see those things. Okay? So, the accessible facilities are actually seen as a negative thing by a fairly small proportion of visitors. They kind of turn their nose up at it and think, man, this isn't for me. Come on, guys, let's go hard, let's go way back into it. And that's not really a problem. We're expecting that, right? We're not at all surprised that some folks are not interested in this at all. But, on the other hand, we have plenty of space to provide for the folks who are not interested in these accessible facilities. And so we don't have to use blunt force trauma to shape our visitors into a single market segment, we might call it, in marketing. That is, if we're providing ADA accessible trails and those rugged trails and those cable hoisting experiments of getting folks up to places like Half Dome with a bespoke one-off system like that, well, then it's okay. We've got something for everybody. If you want to go really hard, if you don't even want to break a sweat, if you don't want to think about breaking a sweat at your national park, we should have a facility for you. Trails in both cases. Okay? And it's the right thing to do. So, more accessible trails can look like this. This is at Bryce Canyon. So if you've never been to Bryce Canyon, it has a steep walled canyon. It's a tiny fraction of the size. But in order to make that steep drop down the wall of the canyon right here, you see how the Park Service has switchbacks? So this tight serpentine folding back on itself, 180-degree turns all the way down the cliff face. The actual slope of the trail as you're running along it, the running slope or transverse slope, we would call that is like 5%, maybe 10%. Okay? So steep enough that you feel it, steep enough that you wouldn't want to sprint up that all day long, but that beats the heck out of people falling down a slope that is well over 100%. 100% slope is 45 degrees, just as a reminder from some of your earlier classes. So, typically, our guideline or our hard cutoff, depending on how borderline your ecosystem is, for the steepness of a trail is going to be 15%. 15% is like the biomechanical limit for what a horse can do safely and comfortably with a rider. And at places like Bryce Canyon, where you have a lot of horse trains bringing tourists through so they can experience without having to walk at this sunny and hot and exposed place. If it's steeper than 15%, those horses are going to really, really struggle because they can't grip the ground. They have a hypodermic needle-shaped hoof that is trying not to slide down and forward when horses are going up a slope, their hooves can bite into the soil and push off and launch them up just fine. If you've ever watched any of those old spaghetti westerns where, you know, the cowboy, John Wayne or somebody is like, you know, John Wayne was like dead long before you guys were born, but anyway, if you've ever seen a horse with a rider trying to go down a steep slope, the horse is almost sitting down because they have very poor control in terms of traction going downhill. So 15% is maximum. Now, in terms of trail erosion, if you want to not be trucking all the soil that used to be at the top of the slope up from the bottom of the slope after every time it rains, and that sounds like a joke, but it's not, because some people don't think about trail design, they just build trail. If you're at all worried about erosion, our soil physics studies over the past 10 years have figured out that, studies by Marion, Wimpy, me, stuff like that, a guy named Dave Cole, but he just retired. If you care about erosion, and generally speaking, the Park Service really cares about erosion, so they don't have to rebuild stuff that they've built constantly, the upper limit on slope is 7.5%, half of what a horse can tolerate. Water, as it turns out, is really good at wrecking your day. So, when we're talking about an ADA compliant trail, it's gonna be typically lower than that. Okay? Here's the section I'm talking about right here. The running slope needs to be 5% or less overall, which means that, with the law of large numbers, if you have short areas where the trail has to be steep briefly because there's just no other place to take the trail, like the landform just gives you that option and that option only, you can go 8.3% for 200 feet. That's not very long. That's not very long at all, okay? And if you are running part of the trail at 8.3% slope, anything more than 5%, you have to have a whole lot of 5% or less slope to average out that steeper slope, that short section, to 5% running slope overall. So this is the exact same math as, have you ever had a class with a whole bunch of, let's say, 5 tests throughout the semester? Just, a class with lots of tests in it. You ever have that experience of you get a low score on the first test and it's like, oh man, now I gotta get an A+ on everything to get my grade up to passing for the semester. If I get awesome grades on everything and totally flunk one test, my overall grade might be a C, and I'm working my ass off for that C, okay? This is the same math. One short section can torpedo your effort for the whole rest of the place to keep that slope below 5%. All right, so let's see. You can go up to 12.5% slope for 10 feet total across an entire trail. That might be a couple of miles long. 10 feet of 12.5% slope. That's less than the steepest slope that a horse can tolerate. That's the length of a single wheelchair ramp. And 12% slope doesn't look like much from the side. It really doesn't. So this would be like in 100 feet forward, it's going up 12.5, not very much. So a 1 in 8 rise. All right, no more than 30% of the total trail length may exceed a running slope of 8.33%. So all of these things, you have to check all of these boxes together, which means that you're going to be coming up with a whole bunch of different alignments or layouts on the map, on the topo map or the 3D GIS surface to figure this stuff out. And, my friends, nerds like me, we write GIS scripts to compute stuff like this, for example. Okay? So you hit the button after generating a layout. I've been experimenting with using AI to do route finding like this. For the non-polynomial hard traveling salesman problem that cannot be solved. Pretty cool stuff. If you like to geek out on trails, come get a PhD with me. All right. Tread obstacles, 2-inch high maximum. Have you ever stepped over a root in a trail that was more than 2 inches above the surface of the trail? Yeah, these have to be smooth, okay? So the radius of a wheelchair's wheel is fairly large, which works in your favor. It's easier to get over bumps the larger the wheel radius is. But we see the same thing with larger diameter tires on a vehicle, but with low profile tires, it's still kind of a rough ride. We have a lot of boxes to check with these ADA compliant trails, and so typically speaking, this is going to get placed on the landscape real close to where it's convenient and safe and cost effective to build buildings, where it's flat, not on cliff edges, and so on and so forth. Okay? So there are significant portions of the path at the Grand Canyon which are really steep, and it's just the rim trail, which you would think would be pretty flat. But as it turns out, right at the edge of the Grand Canyon, you're still doing a fairly decent amount of up and down, and you can get winded pretty easily walking up and down that trail. So it has to, in some cases, switch back, even on an area that looks from, some distance like it's pretty flat up there. It's a plateau. Plateaus we think of as pretty flat. Okay? So this is a lot. This is a lot of constraints, but half the fun and most of the satisfaction of design is working within constraints. When you have an unlimited ability to make the trail vertical in sections, like non-technical rock scrambles and stuff like that, well then you can run the trail anywhere. But here, this is a fun and interesting challenge. So in one of our class exercises coming up, we'll try to do something a little bit like this, just to get a sense of what it's like to lay out a trail on a complex landscape. All right? So, this is a couple of observations from some of your fellow students who did an extended project on accessible trail design. They noticed and sort of surfaced 2 points: that the slope in some portions of a typical proposed ADA trail are way too steep for wheelchair accessibility. So when you load your trail line into a GIS environment and do color symbology coding on running slope for each 1 meter segment of the trail, do you have any sections of the trail that are over that 5%, or critically over that 8.33%, where we start really keeping detailed notes on it? Well, we run out of that budget of steep sections of trail basically instantly, so you transform it a little bit. You can solve intractable problems where the landscape won't let you, like it's physically or mathematically impossible to put an accessible trail in certain places. You can transcend that design problem by changing the premise of it. So if you can get an adaptive pack stock tour program going, where the horses or the mules or whatever are specifically trained and okayed for use with mobility limited folks, then that's another option. Those pack stock can handle up to a 15% slope that wheelchair cannot. But that pack stock fed trail is an ADA compliant option. See how that works? Okay, so it's a lot more logistics, right? Having a live animal program, there are, God, I don't even know how many hundreds and hundreds of horses and mules are used for work and for tours at the Grand Canyon. Hundreds of them. And it means things for things like having to walk down Bright Angel Trail and, walk around, step in a whole bunch of horse and mule poop along the way. It means things at Bryce Canyon when 100 horses ride by you and you have to step off the trail onto the steep downslope side, let them pass, and they're kicking up dried feces, dust that you're breathing in, you're getting it in your eyes, it's like you taste it in the back of your throat. That's how you get thrush and pink eye, it's awful. Anyway, it adds complexity, but it is another way to solve the problem, right? So all of these are good, valid options, done right, and done with people who are certified in things like therapeutic recreation, right? Using horses to help provide access and, in some cases, emotional support to people, or for folks who are wrestling with things like post-traumatic stress. We see animals used in that role as well as mobility aids. You can also, in certain places, not at the Grand Canyon, you can throw fossil fuel energy at the problem to make it go away. So outside of the Grand Canyon, there is a whole bunch of world-class off-roading, jeeping, wall crawling kinds of things, and as long as the driver doesn't, do the Jeep thing and roll it a couple of times, that's a pretty okay option for somebody who's wheelchair bound for the day. Okay? Places like camping areas, we want those to be at least flat within the site, almost perfectly flat, so that works pretty well anyway. We're gonna need to look at our options and have a very sober understanding and estimate of, okay, what can I afford? Concrete is expensive. It releases tons of carbon into the air, but it's durable and it works really well. It's a great solution if you can mitigate the carbon cost of it. Tar and chip asphalt, pretty good option. It's loading a whole bunch of really pretty toxic petrochemicals into an area, so if you have a sensitive watershed nearby, you won't for long. Mixed fines gravel, right? We've all been on gravel paths. The Herbie Byler Trail here in town, which is a really nice walk through the woods if you've never been on it, down to Chautauqua Bottoms. That works very well. Mixed fines. All right, let me draw your attention to that mixed fines phrase. This means this is crushed rock, typically limestone or pea gravel, but not all of the rock is the same diameter. It's all the way from like clay powder dust all the way up to coarse fragments. Coarse fragment is anything larger than 2 millimeters in diameter. So, we've all seen crushed limestone rock paths with rocks up to about this size. As it turns out, when you have mixed fines in approximately equal proportions of sand, silt, and clay with a whole bunch of coarse fragments to bulk it out, that is very, very, very impact resistant, because it forms, in some cases, a limited form of natural concrete called ferrocrete. And that is a useful thing. So you put it in, you let the soil chemistry in this area do its thing, maintain it every once in a while, and that's kind of it. As long as you're trimming off the vegetation that is going to try to infiltrate from the sides root-wise and pull that all apart, it's going to do really pretty well. Compacted soil, tricky. Compacted soil can really harm tree species nearby. So we've got a picture of a road next to some redwoods. Redwoods get killed by roads going by them because they're a shallow, interlocking root strategy tree. They're so big, they're so heavy, and they catch so much wind shear energy at the top end because they're so tall. They get all that extra leverage on the wind, that they all grow and interlock their roots with each other. Instead of sending down like a cottonwood-style taproot 100 feet, they're reaching sideways to be more widely stable, wide planted stable, okay? But that means if you compact soil to put in roads and campsites, like at Redwoods, from a 100-year-old campsite or campground that the Park Service had to completely destroy and remove because all the trees were dying from people camping on them, camping on the roots. That's a thing, okay? But we're not going to run out of compacted soil in an area, so this is very commonly our first choice just because there's typically soil in most places we're trying to build trails. Okay? So, our visitor centers are going to be kind of a very visible part, but also paradoxically, ideally, a pretty invisible part of your infrastructure. So, once people are in that visitor center, it's going to be a world-class experience, right? The cave tours experience video on loop at Mammoth Cave Visitor Center, narrated by Mike Rowe of Dirty Jobs. That strong jawline, cleft chin, deep voice, right? I mean, they sunk some effort into that interp, that environmental interpretation on site. It's a world-class experience. They spent a couple of $1 million building out those exhibits at Mammoth Cave Visitor Center. When they've got the cave right there, the visitor center is literally built on top of one of the major galleries in the Mammoth Cave system. But a lot of people are never going to get in the cave because they can't physically, or maybe psychologically they're kind of uncomfortable with it, claustrophobic, for example. So, that visitor center has got to be very high quality infrastructure, because for a lot of people, that's the experience they get. When you go to the Arches Visitor Center, much the same thing. You walk in, and the first thing you see inside those front doors, after walking past some very, very expensive, very high quality bronze statues of a bunch of the native wildlife around Arches National Park, which you're probably not going to see otherwise, because it's a very arid, relatively high elevation, exposed place. Wildlife are not where people are. So we bring the wildlife to the visitors at the visitor center in the form of sculptures that they can scramble around and get a photo in front of and enjoy it that way. The first thing you see inside the doors at the Arches Visitor Center is an arch. It's a replica arch. And it's very high quality. It's like, we call it prop quality, for those of you who are nerds and have lightsabers at home like me. Okay? It's like a photorealistic reconstruction of a scaled down version of an arch so that it fits inside this visitor center. And then there's a whole bunch of videos and exhibits and interactive stuff to do, and there are typically interpretive rangers kind of wandering around in there that you can talk with and that are excited to see you and give you a really cool, engaging experience before you actually go out to see a whole bunch of natural arches in Arches National Park. Because again, a whole lot of people are visiting parks, for example, once they've been retired for a while. You know, you retire, been saving up money your whole life, let's go see a bunch of the national parks, maybe we'll buy an RV. Some people even sell their house at that point, live in the RV and just bounce around from park to park. If that's your jam, or lifeway, or vibe, or hashtag mood. But a lot of folks who are retired are kind of low-key mobility limited. So they're gonna go to Arches, and they probably can't hike to any arches. So we're gonna bring the arches to them in the visitor center. And it's gonna be high quality. We're gonna do our level best as human beings to bring them a high quality arch adjacent experience in a safe way for them, okay? A lot of people get nailed by heat exposure, heat stroke, heat stress in arches, especially hiking out the Delicate Arch, the very famous arch there. Our trails are going to be everything that you expect trails to be, but it's also going to be anything that is trail-like. So by trails, I'm also talking about, by proxy, things like jeeping roads, or so-called double track. I'm talking about different specific kinds of trails, like single track, which would be like mountain biking trails, or pack trails, which are a little bit different than equestrian trails, which are specifically for horse packing riders, which are a little bit different than hiking trails, a little bit different than vertical climbing vertical trails we call climbing routes or pitches. And all of these are going to be a little bit different than water trails, canoe trails, for example. Okay? But a lot of the design constraints and features of all of these different kinds of trails sort of hew to the same overall philosophy. So when I say trails, also think backcountry or recreational roads, etc., etc., etc. We're also talking about the built environment in terms of signage, conveying information. We're going to talk about infrastructure signage in terms of two roles. First, orientation. Orientation answers the question, where the heck am I? Millions of our visitors to your park are going to be pretty new to the area. A lot of parks see a whole lot of first-time visitors. It is the exception rather than a rule to have people coming back to the same parks over and over and over. But it's pretty cool when you get some of those visitors. They get to know it a lot better. So orientation, we always have to have, as much as we can, everybody knowing exactly where they are. So orientation signage is often present at trailheads. It's often present in the visitor center, and it is all over the map that they try to hand every single visitor at each visitor center. Has anybody ever been to a national park and got one of those black bar, like white text, big black bar title, and then map on one side, flip it over, and it's like a whole bunch of paragraphs and like hand-drawn illustrations on the backside? Yeah. A very common function that National Park Service rangers working at the visitor center are trained explicitly to try to do with as many people as they can is to ask, hey, what brings you here to the park today? And in that one sentence response to that, you can get a whole bunch of information while you are pulling out a fresh copy of that paper map, opening it up for the visitor, flipping it around so the visitor can read it and you're seeing it upside down, pulling out a Sharpie and orienting them to specific things that sound like they match up with the reasons, the motivations, why people are showing up to your park. That's all orientation. Where am I? Where are the things that I want to get to? Wayfinding signage is the how to get there part of it. So, have you ever seen a splash of paint on a tree? Not like like those purple property boundary markers you see at the edges of boundary lines, but stuff like a square, a rectangle, maybe little plastic circles nailed into the outer bark of a tree. That's all wayfinding signage. We call those reassurance markers. We used to call them blazes, but the process of blazing a tree meant, back in the day, pulling out your hatchet or your knife and cutting into the bark to leave some kind of characteristic mark, like something that looks like a hashtag today would be one very common kind of blaze. But as it turns out, that's kind of not great for some certain trees. You don't want to be blazing a whole bunch of beech trees, for example, and cutting them open and wounding them that way. So now we use paint in a reassurance marker, or like a plastic thing that we affix to the outer bark without harming the tree. So orientation and wayfinding, not the same thing, both different kinds of signage, and both critically important. If we're doing this wrong, we're going to start seeing it real soon in our law enforcement and trail patrol teams or staff or colleagues, or us maybe if we're doing it. If those people are slammed with constant search and rescue, then we need to have a talk with our trail crew on getting some more reassurance markers out there, having a talk with our interp rangers on getting those maps into more people's hands, helping folks understand, hey, so it sounds like you guys might want to hike this particular trail. I want you to take careful notice of this particular trail junction here. You see how these two side trails come into the trail that you're going to be on. It looks like they're basically real close to each other, but they're actually, this is kind of a zoomed out map, so you're going to encounter the one on the right-hand side first, then the left-hand side one. If you see a trail crossing, you're in a different place. And people get real confused about that. They have people get lost there all the time, so just want to make sure that you're real clear on, you're going to see the dogleg trail junctions first, then the continuous trail junction after that. So know where you are at each of those places, because the one water source in that area is past the continuous trail junction. Okay? Cool. Want you to be safe out there. Have a great hike. Why don't you come on back and give us a full report? You send them on their way, and they have good orientation information and good wayfinding information in a confusing and potentially dangerous place where water is limited. Campsites and campgrounds. Campgrounds are the larger aerial grouping. Campsites can be formal, designated, permanent, or they could be backcountry, temporary, or even dispersed, like leave no trace style or stealth camping as it's called. Okay, so this is the location, this is the logical grouping of these. Okay, our day use sites, picnic areas, boat launches, interp sites like amphitheaters and so forth. Photo and vista points, because everybody's going to want to take that really cool picture right at this one bend in the road where it's the first time you're driving into the park and you see the mountain range opening up ahead of you, because we realize that's the first place you can see those mountains. So we, the park rangers, cut down all the trees and landscape that area so it just looks like it's kind of an open hillside, but it should be forested like everything else around it, right? So places like the Blue Ridge Parkway in the Shenandoahs, for example, Skyline Drive. It's 70, 80 miles of highway on top of the Appalachian Ridgeline, and I don't know, something like 140 or so kind of bends in the road, which are each specifically landscaped to give you a fresh view, looking west over West Virginia or east towards Washington, D.C. over the Shenandoah Valley area. A really, really pretty place. And that whole road facility is designed to bring people to photo and vista points as dense as every half mile, right? And, maybe you're kind of looking at some of the same spots over and over again, but man, they sure are pretty. And if you're driving Skyline Drive, nobody's holding a gun to your head to get to the far end as fast as you can. So maybe stopping at 20 different spots in 70 miles is not only kind of fine, but it's kind of the point for a lot of people. Okay? So these day use sites are absolutely a part of the infrastructure, and the design of these day use sites is critically important. Because these day use sites are where you are explicitly, on purpose, trying to focus most of your visitor presence and attention. And so if a day use site is located or designed or sited in such a way that it prompts any fraction, any percentage of your visitors to go out past it and crash into the woods because they can't find a bathroom, and tear up the woods and leave a bunch of toilet paper blowing around and dookies everywhere and so forth, that's on us in terms of the design, right? Nobody's holding a gun to our heads to keep bathrooms away from people. So helping folks understand where they are, where the bathrooms are, is a critical piece of making sure these photo and vista points don't get disgusting. Okay, we got to take care of people's creature needs first and always. And we also have transport infrastructure, which these days, in the past about 20 years, the Park Service has, as the youth say sometimes, gone ham. I don't know why the video just cut off. There we are. So the vehicular traffic at these parks, as use is growing, is to the point or beyond capacity in a lot of places. So at Acadia National Park, for example, people were parking up to a mile away from certain sites like Sand Beach or Thunder Hole along the one loop road, the one-way loop road that serves both of those sites, Sand Beach and Thunder Hole. So you have people parking a mile away from where they want to be, not planning on hiking a mile, and hiking a mile along a road with a bunch of cars trying to file by. And it's a two-lane, one-way road, and so the right lane in some places can get kind of choked off with a whole bunch of cars and kids stumbling out into traffic. It's a mess. So that's a capacity issue for the infrastructure. And stuff like miles of roads, numbers of parking lots, size of parking lots is a very, very, very precious commodity in terms of infrastructure in parks. Like at Zion National Park, it's the opposite of Grand Canyon. At Grand Canyon, we have all of our infrastructure, all our roads, all that stuff up on the rim. At Zion, it's all down in the bottom of the canyon. And there's 90% of the canyon in the park is less than, 250 meters wide? There's just not a lot of flat space at the bottom. So there's one road that goes up to the top, and cars can't go up it. It has to be shuttle buses only because that's the only thing that'll fit on that tiny little road system inside of Zion Canyon along the Virgin River. Okay? So these bus interchanges, pretty big deal. At Rocky Mountain National Park, I got to work on a project to help develop the AI that dispatches buses, the shuttle buses, that serve Rocky Mountain National Park, because it is absolutely crazy busy slammed with traffic and visitation from all of the millions of people eating fish tacos and buying weed in Denver and Pueblo and that whole metroplex, Fort Collins. Like, it's all this giant cancer of a city, or a megalopolis sort of thing that's grown together. And then Rocky Mountain National Park is like right there. So there's a ton of pressure in that park. And to the point that they can get one bus out there that's going to replace 50 to 80 vehicles at a time. That's pretty good. In fact, that's really good in terms of noise pollution and tailpipe emissions, right? One engine instead of 50 to 80 engines, and so on and so forth. In a lot of places, we see compressed natural gas buses which burn very, very cleanly, or even hydrogen fuel cell buses that burn hydrogen and oxygen and generate clean water. You know, like, this is a way to reduce stuff like leaky crankcases and dripping oil pans and just all of the hundreds of synthetic chemicals that get into your water supply in a park and start killing off your sensitive species. So, as weird as and unsexy as it is to think about being a park ranger concerned with the idea of, man, I really got to work out this season's bus schedule or we're screwed. Like, yeah, that's a critical function, right? Being able to put pencil to paper or, hand to keyboard with an AI and figuring this stuff out. So that is a real thing. All right, let's see, one or two more here, and then let's end a little bit early so we can come back refreshed next week to do some hands-on stuff. We also have the office buildings. When you go to a place like Yosemite National Park, there are full-size multi-story office buildings. Grand Teton has this massive admin complex of just dozens and dozens of buildings and stuff like that. So this is like your day job office when you're not out in the field doing park rangering stuff. At Grand Teton, for example, the use level monitoring, so the people counting human heads, they share essentially a double wide trailer with the bear ecology team. And so you walk in the front door of this particular one building in this massive office complex, kind of hidden behind a whole bunch of tall trees. And to the one side, you've got like spreadsheets galore, like use level data. And then on the other side, literally floor to ceiling, like pallets of bear spray. And, if you're going out for work that day, just grab one off the thing, nice and fresh, and rock and roll, just in case. So, when we say ops infrastructure, it is equivalent to the city of Carbondale, plus a whole bunch of specialized equipment for research and public administration and stuff like that. Right? So, beyond the water station, power, typically not power generation, but power distribution, radio repeating, at places like Haleakala National Park with a 10,000-foot cinder cone volcano. If you need to radio somebody from inside the crater or radio from one side to the other, you're not doing direct line of sight communication basically ever. You have to hit radio repeaters and hopscotch that signal across a whole ass mountain to talk to somebody on the other side. There are no cell towers and stuff like that. That's just not a thing. So, comms, the interagency dispatch center for most of these places is like, has anybody been to the ops center here at SIU? Man, it's like CSI in there. Like, they've got real-time monitoring of all sorts of metrics and like camera feeds obviously all across campus. So if there's ever like a mass shooting event or something like that, they've got eyes on all over the campus continuously, 24/7, and it's really pretty cool stuff. Now imagine a national park with a couple of million visitors a year, or several million visitors a year, with the same kind of thing and similar needs, but without the ability to real-time monitor the entire place because most of it's backcountry away from cameras. And then you've got an army of volunteers managing stuff like your bear jams, your elk jams, your bison jams, or marmot jams for flatlanders going out west and like, what is that giant rat out there? Okay. And then you got a whole bunch of specialists, resource specialists, concerned with individual species on site and managing them. Specialists for archaeology, specialists for anthropology, talking with current indigenous peoples living in and around your park. Specialists of absolutely every stripe, right? One of the commissioning reasons for the existence of the Park Service in the first place is research and education. And so this is how it gets done. This is why the Park Service is one of the most expertise-heavy organizations in the entire United States federal government, which employs, several 100,000 people. Park Service doesn't employ several 100,000 people, but if you want to work with the Park Service and be doing anything other than like scrubbing toilets, you're probably going to want to start with a master's degree, or do something like get a foot in the door with federal employment in the first place with like the fire hire every year, work a couple of years on that, skill up, get some credentials, get some standing, qualify for some like seasonal permanent jobs, and then move into the Park Service that way. It's difficult and unusual to blast off with your undergrad degree and start working at a national park. In particular, any other recognizable national parks that kind of everybody wants to work at. It's very hard to do that straight out of undergrad. So that's not good, it's not bad, it's not a problem. It's just a specialist heavy place. So typically folks are going in with a master's degree or better. All right? Or equivalent professional experience. Okay. And then on top of that, we've got thousands of people. Was it 3,000 or 4,000 people, I think, at Grand Canyon last time I asked, working there as essentially civilian contractors, right? Running the lodges, running the cafeterias, running a whole bunch of the pack train tours down into the canyon. So you don't necessarily have to be a federal employee to work on site. In fact, typically the concessions staffers largely outnumber at some of the more tourism heavy parks, outnumber the National Park Service staff by quite a bit. So all of your river guides, rafting guides, climbing guides, canyoneering guides, hunting guide, all that stuff is private enterprise. Sometimes with a big company like Xanterra, like Eastern National Forests, here out east. There are a couple of big ones, and then there's a bazillion small ones. You can start your own business as a forestry person, maybe, and interface with the Park Service that way as well. Okay? So, we had to spend kind of a boring day, I apologize about that, talking about stuff like wastewater treatment and marshaling volunteers. Volunteers, although you're not paying them, they're certainly not free to field. You have to have paid staff to coordinate and lead the volunteers and make sure that they don't back into something pretty dumb. Not that they're stupid people, but they're not necessarily trained as foresters like you are. So, there's a lot. Like, this is a pretty big list, and this is even just talking about some fairly broad categories like transport infrastructure. There's a lot more than just roads and lots of bus interchanges, but you get the idea with these, okay? So, we always end on, go to the Park Service website, take a look at your chosen park. I want you to find the admin complex. And I want you to take a look at the map in some real close detail, maybe even load it up in Google Earth, and see if there is line of sight between the admin complex and the nearest large developed campground. can the visitors see where a lot of the rangers and pretty much all of the senior staff of that national park, can they see them? Or are they invisible on the landscape? Usually they're invisible on purpose, because we're not going to national parks. We're not driving to Teton to go see some office building, right? Okay. So that's a thing. So pull out your laptop when you get home and check out your national park. Find that admin complex. You might find several. Bigger national parks have multiple. I think Rocky Mountain National Park has 3 or 4 visitor centers alone, right? And the admin complex there, the admin complex at Denali, at Teton. Haleakala has a couple, and one of them is enormous. There's a lot to see when you start looking at the map in any level of detail beyond what everybody else is looking for. They're looking for the Old Faithful. They're looking for the General Sherman. They're looking for all the exciting icon features and spots. You, this time at least, are looking for all the invisibilia, all the other stuff that is carefully tucked away on the landscape. At Denali, the visitor center is built into the slope below the road. You can't even see it from the road, on purpose. Pretty cool stuff. A Hobbit Hole Visitor Center. Sounds like a very warm and comfortable place. All right, cool. Let's end a few minutes early. We'll cap it right there for today. And plan on next week, I'll bring in some like modeling clay and stuff like that, and we'll start thinking in 3 dimensions about stuff like laying out a trail surface on a complex and rough landscape.